Good afternoon. My name is Dave Scott. My wife back there in the yellow. For those of you that are watching on TV, a number of people complained the last time I was down here that I didn't bring my wife. So she's here today, and you're not. I was hoping that the auditorium would be a little bit more full, but I'm hoping that somebody is at least out there in TV land watching. For those of you that don't know me, my wife and I used to reside here at Carroll Lutheran. About a year ago, we left because we wanted to have our own home. We live now in Gettysburg, just north of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where it was snowing when we left, by the way. Wait a minute. Welcome to England, a place that Carole and I know very well. We lived there for a number of years, and we have returned there frequently to visit and also on business. England is compared to the United States, a very small country, 74 million people. But having worked with the English government, it is our closest ally. And it is also, some people call it the mother country. Today's presentation is going to be more towards the rural parts of England. I will not be visiting London or a couple of other places. I'll show you in a few minutes exactly where we're going to be going. A long way across the Atlantic. I was doing a counting the other day, and I think my wife is even going to be surprised at this number. In my lifetime, I've made 50 crossings across the Atlantic to England and Europe. That's 50 that way, another 50 coming back. We used to live in Yorkshire. Some of you may have heard me give the presentation previously on Yorkshire and one on London. I'm not going to touch either area today. I'm always willing to come back and do them in person, but if I don't come back, you can always get them on YouTube. Both of those presentations are on YouTube under Carroll Lutheran Village. I've outlined where there's stars on this particular map, and I'm going to try and use maps as I go through to keep you oriented to where I'm journeying on this journey around England. But we're going to visit all the locations in it. I can't visit all of England in 1 hour, but this is the highlight reel, so to speak. I'm going to warn you about the next slides. The next slide, they're going to flash. Don't try to look at them. What I'm trying to convey is here in the United States, we have had a number of people, as we know, we're a melting pot, that have come and brought cultures to different parts of the United States. And it's interesting to just look at that over a 100-year period. You can see where parts of this country have been influenced by Germans, by folks coming from England, and other parts of the world. That is the same situation with England. If I can get it to go. We tend to think about England and everybody being English. Well, that's not where they all started from. You have folks in the blue part of this showing of England, actually showing of the entire UK. Here comes my brother-in-law walking down. Blue Peel's my brother-in-law, by the way. Folks that came in from Denmark or Norway or Germany, Turns out that a lot of the folks that are in England came from Central Europe. Up in Scotland, where my family is from, I thought, since I can trace over about 600 people back to places in Scotland back into the 15th and 16th century, that when I did my DNA would come up as being pure Scottish. I'm 49% Scandinavian. So how did people come into England? There's a big wide channel. The narrowest part is 34 miles wide. Well, right there between that narrowest part, at one point was a land bridge. And that land bridge got wiped out during the Ice Age. Just as the Great Lakes were created here in the United States, those glaciers came through that caused they took the land bridge away and created what we call the English Channel today. But between Dover and Calais has always been a main thoroughfare, but it's a thoroughfare across 34 miles of water. Up until 1994, the primary way of going between England and what's called the continent, or you talk about France or Belgium, is by a ferry. These ferries carry passengers, cars, and trucks. They call them in England lorries. That was the main way across for many, many years. It's a way that Carole and I have gone a number of times. Oops. Sorry about that, the finger clicked too fast. In 1984, the English government and the French government came together and said, we need to find a better way to transport goods and people between England and the continent. And they agreed to build a tunnel between Dover and Calais. The problem was neither government had the funding to do so. So independently, over 50 banks, both in England and in France, funded the building of a thing that's called the Channel. And that was to the tune of $21 billion. Now, there have been plans to try to connect the two countries, or at least the continent and the UK, for many years. There have been designs about building islands out there. Even Hitler thought about pouring lots of dirt, but that never would have worked because it's too deep. So they decided to use a channel or a tunnel. But that tunnel had to go almost 250 feet below the water. And it had to go, if you look on this slide, you'll see a red banner and a darker banner. Those are two layers of clay. They wanted to be below those two layers so that the water didn't seep down and try to enter the tunnel. Oops, went back. By the end, I'll perfect this. The tunnel was actually 3 tunnels. One going from England to France, and another one coming back from France to England, and an emergency tunnel or a maintenance tunnel in between. Now, it's not a car tunnel. Only trains go through these tunnels. And because of a risk of an accident, there is a connection between the tunnels and the particular emergency tunnel every 1,300 feet. It took 6 of these machines and 10 years to build the tunnel. What is amazing is there was a French company and an English company doing the digging at the same time coming across. And they met in the middle of the English Channel, or the Straits of Dover, and they only had 18 inches difference. They were only off by 18 inches. As I said, the primary way of going through the channel, the only way, is by train. And there are two types of trains, and I'm going to address those in a second. But it's a very busy place. 70,000 people cross through this channel every day. Now, one way you do it, you drive down to, if you're going to France, you drive down to Dover, about an hour and a half south of London. And after you go through customs and immigration and all that good stuff, you then get onto a train. And this is showing one of the train cars for a car. There's also ones that are higher for trucks. And you get on there, and for 35 minutes, you sit as the train takes you through the tunnel. But the good news is, it's hooked up so you can listen to internet, you can listen to TV stations, you can listen to radio. And so you can be entertained while you sit in your car for that 35 minutes. The other way, you can take a train from downtown London, right near the Thames, to Paris, to Brussels, or to Amsterdam. It takes, this chart says it takes about 2 hours and 47 minutes. In reality, the transit time is 2 hours and 15 minutes. They travel between 150 miles an hour to 160 miles an hour. Lots of people use this. Why? If you wanted to go by the boat, you got to drive that hour and a half down to Dover, and then an hour and 45 minutes on the boat, and then drive to Paris. Or if you wanted to fly, and you're in downtown London, it's an hour out on the tube, or we would call the subway, out to Heathrow. Then you got an hour and a half waiting for your plane, and an hour and 35 minutes to Paris. But when you get to Paris, you're at Orly, so you've got an hour's train ride into Paris. Much easier to take a train from downtown straight to Paris. You can leave early in the morning, get to Paris by 8, 9 o'clock, do your business, and come home the same day. We're going to leave Dover and the cliffs, the White Cliffs of Dover. Some of you may remember, at least as a kid I did, because I grew up with Scottish parents and family, is a song during World War II, The White Cliffs of Dover. They're made of chalk, and they're pretty high. They're pretty beautiful also. First stop that we're going to go to is Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain. Oops. I do have some notes here so I don't get mixed up. Anyway, this is Stonehenge. You've probably seen it many, many times. There are so many stories about why Stonehenge exists. Well, first of all, I got to tell you, it's not the only one. Throughout England and Wales and Scotland, there are other similar ones, but this is probably the largest one. There's been theories, was it created as a place of worship? Was it about the sun gods? Was it, there's a number of theories. None of them have been proven. But there are some facts about Stonehenge. If you look at the stones that are going straight up and down, they weigh about 25 tons. They're not local. Geologists have determined that they were mined about 35 miles to the west of Stonehenge. And this mining occurred sometime between 2,000 and 3,000 BC, essentially 5,000 years ago. So how did they get stones that are 25 tons? By the way, there's just as many, it's like an iceberg. There's more stone under the ground than you can see on top. That's the stones going vertical. The stones on top are known as blue stones. Blue stones are not found in England. They're found in Wales, approximately 60 miles away. They're a little less in weight. They only weigh 3 tons apiece. How did they get them there? How did they get them up? That is the big question. If you go to Stonehenge today, you can't get close to the stones. That's because too many tourists would go and, believe it or not, try to chip some of the stone off, or they would put graffiti on the stone. So there are now walkways around the entire part of where all these stones are located. If you look at this picture, you'll see like a semicircle. There are other stones that are out there in the ground. I always have an image of Carol's mother and father visited us, and Carol's mother and Carol were walking out there on a very windy and rainy day. And so that's an image that I have of that location. Now, this is a picture taken on that day. This is her father and myself when I had dark hair. And we're hiding behind the stones because it's raining like hell and the wind is blowing. We're going to go across the southern part of England. And this is in the fall. There's some very, very picturesque areas as you go across southern England. We're going to go out to an area called Cornwall. Cornwall sits at the furthest western part of England, hence the name Land's End. I talked about different peoples populating different parts of the UK. Folks here tended to be Celts. Celts came originally, now Celts are usually associated with Ireland and Scotland, but they came from southern Russia. Celts speak a language called Gaelic. Cornwall has a unique part of Gaelic. Up until about 50 years ago, that was a pretty common language in Cornwall. It died out, but they are bringing it back and they're teaching it in what's equivalent to grade school today. The northern part of Cornwall sits facing out to the Atlantic Ocean, and it has lots of cliffs, very, very steep cliffs, very rugged and very beautiful. I assume you've seen those, Louis. I've circled on this particular picture caves. One of the things that Cornwall is famous for are smugglers and pirates. They used to bring in liquor, later years tobacco, and avoid the taxman. This is Land's End. It's a place that I know very well, but from about 40,000 feet. That's because I used to fly very frequently, and I used to be known as the unfriendly traveler, because as soon as I got on, we took off out of Dulles or New York. I'd put a mask on and go to sleep and ask the crew to wake me up when we got to Land's End, because then I knew that I was either going into Heathrow or I was going into Brussels. Anyway, you can start to see in the foreground of this picture, that's the Atlantic Ocean, where it's a little bit more bluish green, That is the channel. Cornwall is 10 degrees warmer than, on average, than any other part of the UK. And it's because the Gulf Stream hits here. The south side, facing the channel, has lots of lovely beaches. The population of Cornwall is about 500,000 people, but it is a very popular summertime area for English people, particularly from the urban areas, to go. And the population can swell to 5 million people. 25% of the economy in Cornwall is based on tourism. This is an entrance to a tin mine. Up until about 1900, 1910, the primary source of tin, which you can find on the periodic table, was England and was Cornwall. Now, I grew up, Carol and I were talking about this, prior to World War II, what we call aluminum foil, we used to call tin foil. I still call it tin foil. I still call cans tin cans. But the mining in England stopped around 1920 because Australia became the source of tin at that point. This was dangerous work. They would go down through these mines, the work elevators, they climbed down, and the mines went out under the channel. And it was pickaxe digging for ore, which they brought up. Little interesting fact that I didn't think about. Tin was not just useful making tin plates and foil and so on. It was very important in terms of, in the 1800s, of armament. Because you mix tin with copper and you get bronze, and it's very hard. Clotted cream. You can get it on scones. This is with some berries on it. What is clotted cream? They take very high milk, raw milk, high fat, what do you call them? There's a term for it, but the fat in the milk. And they heat it just below boiling. And what happens is the fat or the cream comes to the top and clumps together or clots, and then it is scooped off. Very, very rich. And the other thing they do with it in Cornwall is make ice cream. Very rich ice cream. The thing to the right of the picture is a dish that was created originally for the miners. They could take it down in the mine and that'd be their lunch or dinner. Today, it is the McDonald's of Cornwall. They sell over 5 million of them, not 100, 5 million of them every year. So what are they? Well, as you can tell, they're a pastry. But inside, you have mincemeat. As a kid, I grew up after World War II with mincemeat. It was just chopped meat and put a little salt in it. This has dried fruit. It has liqueur in it and some spices. It's cold, but they love it. And as they sell a lot of them. Still in Cornwall. We only have three. We got 4. We'll count Lou. Anybody recognize this particular harbor? All right, I'm not going, you're a ringer. This harbor, if you watch PBS television, it's It's called Port Isaac. But on TV, it's called Port Wyn. Why? The TV show that's on PBS is Doc Martin. Very, very popular show here in the United States. But I'm going to show you around Port Isaac a little bit. Where I have the arrow is the so-called surgery for Doc Martin. What you don't see in the TV is the big house behind it. The shot that you see on the TV is this one. It's not a doctor's office, it's actually a private residence. They only use it for outside shots. But I called it a surgery. You would think that's where they do surgery. They don't do surgery in doctors' offices. Surgeries is a term in the UK for any office or waiting area where you go to see a professional. So a lawyer, his lobby is also called a surgery. I'm going to the next county, Devon, and Plymouth. We all learned about the Pilgrims, but we didn't learn everything about this. Yes, the Pilgrims left from Plymouth, England, and they went to Plymouth, what's now called Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Plymouth Rock. What we don't know is that there was 102 individuals on board the Mayflower. Of that 102, 54 were not pilgrims. They were not going after religious freedom. They had charters from the king to go and get their spoils in the New World. They also weren't going to Massachusetts. They were going to Virginia. But through two things, navigational errors and storms, the ship didn't arrive off Virginia, it arrived off of Massachusetts. I'm happy to see my brother-in-law here in the back, but we're going to visit a little town called Brixem. In 1900, it was the principal fishing port in England. At that point in time, over 300 fishing boats would come in and release their catch. Today, there are fishing ports throughout the United Kingdom. There are still a few fishing boats coming into Brixem, but that's not the trade there today. I wanted to make a special call out for the next slide. You can look up at the top, you can see that this is a very, very old church. It is a church that CLV has a connection to. Because Lou Peel, my brother-in-law, I don't say that too often, my brother-in-law, served there one summer in a pastoral exchange and has kept contact with the people in Brixem for many, many years. We go next door to Torquay. Torquay is, the Brits like to call it the English Riviera. I like to call it more like Ocean City. It has a boardwalk. It has also lots of lights. It even has palm trees. But a lot of Brits go there for vacation. And the various parties, political parties, hold their conferences or conventions there. But one thing about it's a very pretty spot. And it's a spot where one of the most prolific writers, Agatha Christie, lived. She lived up on the hill. Another part of Devon is Dartmoor. I was going to talk about it. It's got a bad prison there, but I'll leave that one out. But Dartmoor is one of the largest national parks in England. Now, it's like parks here. You'll have a national park, but you'll still have some private places within the park. And that's the same here in Dartmoor. Dartmoor has two distinct parts to it. Very fertile, very gorgeous green part of the area, and another, what we call moors, very barren ground with large rocks coming out of it. These rocks, they're granite, and they continue to be, as the earth moves, they continue to rise up. A human did not make those things. That came up out of the earth. I said I wasn't going to talk about London, but this is a picture in downtown London. It's known as Piccadilly Circus. I wanted to raise this because I'm going to talk about World War II and the south part of England. And there's a term there called, and when I get to the next slide, called Piccadilly Circus. Piccadilly Circus is in the heart of London, the West End. It has 7 streets that come into it. Having driven there, it's fun to drive, particularly if you're not used to driving on the left side of the road. And so it's a big convergence coming into any part of town. Just FYI, that building with the green on the top is a hotel where Carole and I used to stay many, many times. This is the reason I wanted to point out. You'll see in this slide a big oval called Piccadilly Circus. This is when the Allies invaded Normandy in 1944. You can see that U.S. troops came out of various ports, whether that be Portland, Poole, Brixem even, and they came to a part of the channel, and that became called Piccadilly Circus because they all merged up ready to go into the various beaches. The United States, as you well know, had Utah and Omaha Beach. This is Poole. This is one of the sites where U.S. forces marshaled to go into the Normandy beaches. This picture is purposely blurred. These are troops in Poole marching down to their landing craft. It's blurred because some of those troops never made it off the beaches in Normandy. This is a building, again in Devon. It's part of what they call the National Trust now. But this is the building where General Eisenhower and General Montgomery monitored the whole Normandy invasion. This is a beach that's, again, out in Cornwall, Slapton Beach. This is a part of the history of the Normandy invasion that you don't hear very much about. There were lots of practices for the invasion. Most of it was done up in Scotland. But a few days before the invasion, they decided they needed one final practice, and they did this at this beach. Unfortunately, there was a German U-boat present, and he sunk a troop transport with 767 American soldiers on board, who all died. That is sad. We leave Devon, we move over to a town called Winchester. Not Winchester, Virginia, but Winchester, England. I don't know why, every time I think of Winchester, I think of the Beatles singing Winchester Cathedral. That's me. This is Winchester Cathedral. Now, what a lot of people don't know is Winchester was the capital of England up until the 12th century, not London. This is Winchester Cathedral. As such, there are 9 kings that are buried under the floor of that chapel. Also turns out that if you were to walk to the far end of the Winchester Cathedral, I should say, in the year 677, the first Christian church was constructed in England. This cathedral was built between 1057 and 1523. They didn't have a lot of modern tools and stuff to do it in those days. And how did they keep up these very, very steep cathedrals? Well, Lou Peel's father taught me something. This is a picture where you see the arrow. I called flying buttresses. And that's what keeps up these very tall cathedrals. That actually goes in the ground about 30 feet. This is the inside of Winchester Cathedral. 1,000 years old. How many buildings here in the United States can look that good in 1,000 years? Question for you. I figured we'd have a bunch of people here, so you only have a question. I told you about all these people coming in from Europe, coming in from Denmark, Norway, some as far away as southern Russia. So in the year 1066 through middle of 1300s, what was the official language in England? Anybody got a guess? French. Because the French invaded England in 1066. And so French was the official language, and the French were the kings until the 1300s. We're going to move from Winchester out to a place called the Cotswolds. It is a place where English people, see you later, Louis. He has an excuse to go. Big excuse. Anyway, it's a place where the Brits love to walk. This is an area that is surrounded by 5 counties. Lots of places to walk throughout it. And so they do en masse. I even have a friend of ours. She was 85 years old. She walked from one end of the Cotswolds to the other. The Cotswolds is not just a big area of open land. It has a number of villages. There's a place I've put into a rectangle up there, Cheltenham, where I used to go and do a lot of business. But there you have these very, very cute, that's not the operative word, but places to go and see and have a good time. As I said, you walk. Carol, you're making too much noise out there. Anyway, you can walk throughout. There can be these paved paths going by these houses. By the way, these houses were probably built in, late 1600s. If you go inside them, they're as modern as our houses are. They refurbish their houses, they don't tear them down. One of the things in England is there are right-of-ways for walking paths everywhere. You can go across a farmer's field, and as long as you stay on that path, you're not trespassing, you have a right-of-way to go. We're still in the Cotswolds. This is one of the paths across a farmer's field. And this gentleman's stopping to say hello to some animals. As long as you stay on the path, you're not trespassing, and you're welcome. This gentleman's going off many, many Gothic-type churches throughout the Cotswolds. One of the nice things in these little villages, there's always a pub. This one's along a nice river. You can sit out there if it's nice. One of the things of living in England, you need to understand that rain is called liquid sunshine. You just go even when it rains. But you could stop there, or you could, most of the pubs will also have places that you can rent a bedroom for the night and have a bed and breakfast. There's also some big houses. Everybody thinks the royalty all lives in London. They only go there for business. Most of them live in the Cotswolds. You can see William and his wife there. That's their house down in the lower right. The house above that is Charles, Prince Charles's house. The house to the left is Princess Anne's house. And the house down below, help me out, Carol. Harry. Now, he and his wife supposedly live in California. They still own this house. They rent it out. On the edge of the Cotswolds is a very, very famous university, Oxford. Oxford has about 25,000 students. 51% of them are in graduate school, 49 are undergraduates. Half of the population, or students, are from the UK, that meaning England, Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, and they go there for free, provided they have the grades and get entered in. There are actually 24 colleges within the university, but the beauty of it is you can be at King's College, and if they're not offering a class here, you can go to one of the other colleges. Just looking at one of the colleges and some of the grounds. But there's a little story that I'd like to tell you here. There was a professor, a mathematics professor, and he was world famous. Written a number of books. But he had a little bit of a sweet spot in his heart for his daughter. His daughter was named Alice. And Alice loved to hear him tell stories. And he would make up these stories, and he would tell them to her. And as she grew older and got into her teens, she begged him to write them down. He refused. He said, "I am known as a world-renowned mathematician. I don't want to be known as somebody that writes children's stories." Well, lo and behold, she grows up. She becomes 22 years old and she gets married. And as a wedding gift to her, he had one of her favorite stories typed and given to her. She was so overjoyed. She said, "Dad, we need to publish this." He said no. Took her several years, and finally he agreed, but only if he could do it under another name. Lewis Carroll. You all know the story. Alice in Wonderland. I mentioned that the school had lots of foreign students, meaning Americans. That's of the other, besides folks from the UK, students from the United States make up the largest part of the student body. But every time, this is a picture of the uniforms that folks that are students there must wear. And I have a problem when I look at this picture of the students. Cambridge has got a similar type student. That's the other big school in the UK. But do you know two people that are graduates? You do. Well, at least you know one. President Clinton. I can't imagine him going around looking like this. And then, if you ever watch MSNBC, Rachel Maddow is also a graduate of. We now move further up from London, and we come to Stratford-on-Avon, Shakespeare's country. Bet you didn't know he grew up in a duplex. The house to the right is where he was born. Now, it turns out, as one of the writers, that he made a lot of money. A lot of writers back then didn't make a lot of money. He had a house, a big house later on in Stratford-on-Avon. He had an even larger house in London, as well as his theater in London. It's called Stratford-on-Avon because it's on the Avon River. The Avon River is the longest river in England, and it flows into the Thames. Most Americans call it the Thames. It's the Thames, and that goes through London. I'm going to revert back for a minute before going to the next slides and talk about World War II. The reason that the U.S. and the rest of the Allies made the invasion of Normandy, because at the Yalta Conference, the Russians pushed for a third offensive. Remember, the Russians were were fighting them up on the Eastern Front. We had come in with the Allies across North Africa, and now we were in Italy pushing north. The Russians wanted us to push straight in and get into Germany. And it was agreed upon at that conference that Normandy would be the location for the invasion. Unfortunately, Hitler had some spies, and he found out that Normandy was going to be the location. And he started to order heavier armament, troops, so on and so forth in that area. But he changed his mind, and he changed his mind for the following reason. There's a thing called the Ghost Army. Now, a lot of you that remember World War II, remember General Patton. He got in trouble in Italy because there were a couple of soldiers that were totally fatigued out, and he yelled at them to get back into battle, and he slapped them with his gloves. He was relieved of command. Well, they didn't quite know what to do with Patton. So somebody came up with a brilliant idea. Let's have him go around and look like we've rehabilitated him. And then they came back and they named him as being the person that was going to lead the invasion. Well, it wasn't quite true. Omar Bradley led the invasion. What Patton got was a group of about 1,100 soldiers. 1,100 soldiers whose background prior to the war were in Hollywood or in the theater, either making movies, set designs, costumes, so on and so forth. And they fictitiously made a counter army, which I'm going to show you in a minute. By the way, this was classified up until the mid-90s. because some of the techniques that they used were used also by the Allied forces in other areas. What they did was go into a place called East Anglica. It's actually to the northwest of London. There's 4 counties there. And this was a location that already had a lot of military forces, but it wasn't the types of forces that were going to do an amphibious attack. They were mostly the air bases and the support to those air bases of planes going in and attacking Germany. What these folks did was they made fictitious army encampments. These are called Quonset Huts, and they built them all around. The problem is they're balloons. They're not real. They made tanks. They made planes. They made amphibious boats, and they put them around. Now, how could 1,100 people convince spies that there were more troops there, and East Anglia was in a place that was ideal to go into Calais? These guys at night would go out on their bicycles and move the balloons all around, so it looked like there was more than there actually was. Hitler said, gee, I don't know. So he did not armor the area down in Normandy as much as he did Calais. If he had gone with his first judgment, we probably would not have succeeded with that invasion. We now move up a little bit further. We're still in East Anglia to a place called the Norfolk Broads. Back in the 1800s, the principal source of heating in English homes was peat. And they would go out and dig this peat out of the ground, and they left big holes. Well, over time, it rains a lot in England. Those holes filled up with water. It's now a national park called the Norfolk Broads. To you, this looks like just a couple of lakes and a horizon out there. That's actually, on the far part, is the North Sea. But the beauty of this national park is you can go there and rent a boat and travel around the canals. This is the type of boat that when Carole and I lived in Brussels, we came over and spent a week in the Norfolk Broads, cruising along on a little boat like this. It only could go, it's restricted to go 7 miles an hour, but it has a nice queen-size bed in it. It has a kitchenette in it. It has a shower and toilet, and it had a TV. And you could go around. Also, the roof slides back and forth. But you didn't need to cruise the whole time. You could moor your boat alongside and walk into a little village and just enjoy the countryside. It was a very memorable vacation for us. One difference. It's also an area where it has a lot of wildlife, and they're protected. The picture in the lower right is a picture of some very beautiful swans. Well, one morning I got up, I pushed the roof back, and there were 2 swans out on the foredeck. And I got out and I went and I said, scoot! Well, 2 of them came at me with their beaks. It wasn't until I learned later on that swans can actually break a man's leg with their beaks. I now respect swans. Oops. During the winter, farmers go in and they cut down straw, because a lot of houses, particularly in the southern part of England and over in Belgium and the Netherlands, have straw roofs. It's antiquated. No, it's not. It's very well insulated, and the rain doesn't go through. Oops. Picture of a house in the Norfolk Broads with a, problem is they don't stay that brilliant golden color, they turn very dark. I mentioned as you could get out and you could walk around in little villages and go to a pub. Well, a lot of us think of a pub as a place to drink. It's a place to go and eat. And particularly in Norfolk Broads, you can go in and have what's called a plowman's lunch, which is a bunch of cheese, some fruit, maybe some wafers of some sort, and then, yes, a pint. But it was a good place to go have a meal. I mentioned earlier that you could see the North Sea. Well, whether you believe in global warming or not, seas are rising, and they're etching away the Norfolk Broads. This is the beach, and what they've done is they've put rocks along the beach to try and protect it from the waves. But the story I want to share with you. We had moored our boat, and Carol and I walking along the beach. We're having a good time. We walked quite a ways up the beach. I said, well, it's time to go back. Well, let's not walk back along the beach. We can just cut through this sand dune and go over because that's where our boat is moored. And that's what we did. When we got out the other side of the sand dunes, we were greeted with this sign. There's a place full of adders. There's only one poisonous snake in England, and it's an adder, and it's right here. We had walked through a bunch of places where adders were nesting. We're now going to leave England and rural, and we're going to go to a not-so-rural place. I'm going to go to Liverpool. This is the Mersey River. I don't know why, it always looks kind of muddy and dirty. Liverpool was always known as a blue-collar town. Lots of industry, particularly after the Industrial Revolution. But it was also known as another spot. Between 1830 and 1930, 9 million people left, not all from England, but from Europe, and came to the United States. Do a little math. All right, I got a couple that comes in 1850, and they have 2 kids, and they have 2 kids. 9 million people translates to a lot of Americans that can trace their heritage back coming through Liverpool. This is downtown Liverpool. Probably not very interested, but that's the City Hall. Does anybody recognize the statues? Help you out. The Beatles. Now, if you know the Beatles, they were over in Germany originally, and then they came back, and they were, quote, quote, discovered in the Cavern Club in Liverpool. Now, if you notice, I've put an arrow down to the drummer. The drummer is not Ringo. His name was Best. He decided that the Beatles were not ever going to succeed, and he went to another band, and that's when Ringo came in. Here's the Cavern Club, and they've put a statue out there to John Lennon. They not only put a statue to John Lennon in Liverpool, they named the airport after him. This is one that is very close to Carol and I. We lived in Yorkshire, England, back in the late 60s. And in 1963 on BBC, by the way, in those days, there was only BBC One and BBC Two television. That was it. A soap opera started. It showed at 5 o'clock every afternoon. By the way, BBC didn't come on till 4 o'clock in the afternoon and went off at 11 o'clock at night. Anyway, this was a soap opera. It continues today. It is shown in 34 countries around the world. If you want to see it, go to Canada. But early on, the producers did a smart thing. There were a bunch of houses in downtown Liverpool that were going to be demolished. They bought them up, including the pub. That is where the shows are taped, inside those houses till today. If you watch any of British comedies or British shows, I can guarantee you one of those stars got their start on Coronation Street. This is just a bunch of people that have been in the show over the years. But there are over 250 people, actors and actresses, that can trace their first start back to Coronation Street. Okay, what am I showing you? A rusty old boat. Told you, Yorkshire, England, late 60s. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have cable TV. We had BBC One and BBC Two. In the late 60s, ITV, independent television or commercial television, came in, and it was only another channel, so we had three. When we lived in Brussels, we had a heck of a lot more. Radio stations, they were all by the BBC. They were mostly local, like Liverpool, London, Manchester, so on and so forth, and they all played symphonic music. The kids wanted to hear the Beatles and all the other rock and roll stars. So an entrepreneur got a boat, anchored it out in the Irish Sea, away from the outer limits of England. They put up a mast, and they transmitted 24/7 rock and roll music. Now, why is it Liverpool? Because they were all taped in Liverpool, and boats would go out with the tapes out to the boat. We come to the Lake District. Lake District is almost up to Scotland, but not quite. And it is, as it said, it's another area that's a national park. This is Lake Windermere, one of the lakes in the Lake District. Lake District is very famous because a lot of poets, a lot of writers live there. This particular lake is very deep. It is over 279 feet deep at its steepest spot, 56 feet below sea level. Like the rest of England, there's lots of spots that you can walk, only lots of mountains if you're into it, or climbing over those hills and mountains. I always beware that some, not in this group, but in other groups, that they may need to know the story of Peter Rabbit. Beatrice Potter. She wrote over 23 children's books, world famous. She lived in the Lake District. The house that she was born in is on the left, the one on the right when she started to make some money, and then that castle-looking place is where she lived till the end of her life. We're getting near the end. We're getting to Northumberland, and particularly Newcastle. Now, Newcastle and Northumberland used to be a large part, even of Scotland, but it's now just a small county. It faces onto the North Sea. Very nice beaches, very, very cold water. I don't go swimming there. It's like going swimming in the northern part of Maine. But the Brits do. These little white structures are cabins where people will go and stay for what they call their holidays. We call it vacation. They call it holidays. Northumberland has a number of little ports, again, fishing ports. And it always has a pub. You can look back there and you can see a sign up there on one of the buildings, and that's where the fishermen would come in and have their drinks. How many of you have had Earl Grey tea? Okay? Twinings of London, Earl Grey. Now, Earl Grey in 1840 was the Prime Minister of England, but he was from Northumberland, and that's where that tea was created, not in London. I showed you some beautiful beaches. Along the entire coast, there is a path that you can walk again. As long as you stay on the path, you're not trespassing. Of all the castles in England, Northumberland has the most number of castles. This particular castle has been used in many, many movies. This is Hadrian's Wall. I didn't mention it at the outset, but one of the other groups that came into England and the UK were the Romans. There was an emperor called Hadrian. In 863, he visited this particular area. Well, some of my relatives had a nasty habit of not necessarily working. They did a lot of raiding of what's now England. And he said, build a wall to keep those heathens up north. And so this wall was built. It's 73 miles long, and it still stands today. My final slide, you know my last name. You know I have a close connection to Scotland, although I lived in England for many years. I'll read it in case you can't see it on the TV. Not everyone is perfect, but if you live in England, then you're pretty close to Scotland, where they are. I thank you very much. Any questions?
Where is Downton Abbey?
Downton Abbey, I happen to know where it is. It doesn't exist in reality, but it actually exists in the northern part of Yorkshire, where we lived. It's closer to Newcastle, probably, than to where Carole and I lived, but that's where the building that they used. And if you notice, in Downton Abbey, they'll talk about going to Ripon, they'll talk about going to Harrogate, and they'll talk about going to Leeds. Carole and I lived in Harrogate. Sorry, guys that are out there in TV land, you can't ask me a question. I thank you. I did that in an hour and 10 minutes, by the way.